On a bitter December evening in 1863, when Atlanta's most powerful families gathered to celebrate love amidst the chaos of war, 15 crystal glasses were raised in unison for what would become their final toast. The champagne sparkled like liquid gold in the candlelight of Magnolia Heights' grand ballroom, but hidden within those elegant flutes lay a darker secret than any Confederate conspiracy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What the distinguished guests didn't realize as they lifted their glasses to honor the newlyweds was that their fate had been decided months earlier in a plantation kitchen by a woman whose children had paid the ultimate price for their family's cruelty. This is the story of how Celia Freeman transformed grief into precision, sorrow into strategy, and a wedding celebration into a courtroom where justice would finally be served. In the heart of Georgia, where Sherman's armies marched ever closer, and cotton still commanded fortunes built on human suffering, one woman discovered that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword or a rifle, but knowledge carefully cultivated and patience perfectly timed. The Blackwood family wedding would be remembered throughout the South, but not for the reasons anyone expected. The Magnolia Heights plantation sprawled across 1,500 acres of prime Georgia soil, its boundaries marked by ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss that had witnessed generations of both prosperity and suffering. 15 miles southeast of Atlanta's growing railroad hub, the estate stood as a monument to Southern aristocracy, its Greek Revival mansion rising from manicured grounds like a temple to wealth built upon the backs of 300 enslaved souls. Judge Harrison Blackwood surveyed his domain from the wraparound veranda each morning, his steel-gray eyes taking inventory of property both human and material with the same calculated assessment. At 58, he commanded respect not just as one of Georgia's wealthiest planters, but as a Confederate military tribunal judge, whose decisions had sent dozens of Union sympathizers to their deaths. His word carried the weight of law across 3 counties, and his influence reached into the highest circles of Confederate leadership. The main house itself embodied everything the Blackwood name represented. 6 towering columns supported a facade that spoke of permanence and power, while inside, imported crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across polished marble floors. The grand ballroom could accommodate 50 guests for dancing, its French doors opening onto terraced gardens, where magnolia trees perfumed the air with their intoxicating blooms. Every detail had been chosen to impress, to intimidate, to remind visitors that they stood in the presence of true Southern nobility. Mrs. Constance Blackwood presided over this domain with the iron will that had made her Atlanta's most feared social arbiter. Her approval could launch careers, her disapproval could destroy reputations, and her guest lists determined who mattered in Confederate society. She moved through her mansion like a general commanding troops, her silk skirts rustling orders to servants who understood that perfection wasn't just expected but demanded. Behind her gracious smile lay a mind that calculated social advantage with the precision of her husband's legal arguments. The kitchen complex stood apart from the main house, connected by a covered walkway that allowed the family to enjoy elaborate meals without enduring cooking smells or servant noise. This separation served a dual purpose, maintaining the fiction that their luxurious lifestyle materialized without labor, while ensuring that the real architects of their culinary reputation remained invisible to guests. The kitchen itself rivaled those of Atlanta's finest hotels, with 3 massive hearths, marble preparation surfaces, and pantries stocked with delicacies shipped up from Savannah and down from Charleston. It was here, in this temple of culinary excellence, that Celia had built her reputation as the finest cook in 3 counties. At 28, she possessed an intuitive understanding of flavors that bordered on artistry, transforming simple ingredients into dishes that left grown men speechless and society ladies begging for recipes they would never receive. Her hands could coax magic from cornmeal and molasses, could turn a simple chicken into a feast worthy of governors, could create desserts so delicate they seemed to dissolve on the tongue like sweet dreams. Celia had arrived at Magnolia Heights 12 years earlier, as part of an estate sale, a teenage girl with calloused hands and eyes that held secrets. The plantation's previous cook, Aunt Dinah, had recognized something special in the newcomer beyond her obvious cooking skills. During long winter evenings when kitchen work slowed, Dinah had shared knowledge that went far beyond recipes and techniques. She taught Celia to read the subtle signs in nature, to understand which plants healed and which harmed, to recognize the delicate balance between medicine and poison that had kept their people alive for generations. Aunt Dinah carried memories that stretched back to her childhood in Virginia, where her grandmother had learned plant lore from Cherokee women before the tribes were driven westward. This knowledge lived in the careful observation of seasons, in understanding which roots gathered strength in winter darkness, which berries concentrated their essence in autumn cold. She showed Celia how pokeweed's purple berries could ease rheumatism in tiny doses, but brought death in larger amounts, how castor beans could cure or kill depending on preparation, how beautiful oleander flowers harbored toxins more deadly than any snake. The old woman never spoke directly about using this knowledge for anything beyond healing, but her lessons carried darker implications. She would examine a wilted leaf and murmur about how some wounds went too deep for healing herbs, how sometimes nature provided other solutions for problems that couldn't be solved with kindness. Celia listened with the intensity of a scholar, memorizing not just the plants but their properties, their seasons, their preparation methods, storing this dangerous wisdom in her mind like books in a hidden library. When Aunt Dinah died of consumption 3 years earlier, Celia naturally assumed control of the kitchen, bringing with her innovations that elevated the Blackwood reputation to legendary status. She trained a small staff of assistants with exacting standards, each woman responsible for specific aspects of meal preparation, but none privy to Celia's most important secrets. Sarah handled bread and pastries with skilled hands, Betty prepared vegetables and preserved foods with methodical precision, while young Lucy fetched ingredients and cleaned with enthusiastic energy. Celia's own family lived in a cabin slightly larger than the standard quarters, a privilege granted in recognition of her value to the household's social standing. Her husband Isaiah worked the plantation forge, his strong hands shaping iron into tools and horseshoes, while his quiet dignity earned respect from both enslaved and free workers. Their 3 children represented everything beautiful and hopeful in their constrained world. Rebecca, at 8 years old, already showed her mother's quick mind and steady hands, helping in the kitchen when lessons permitted. Jonathan, 6 years old, possessed his father's thoughtful nature and spent hours watching Isaiah work the bellows, learning the rhythm of hammer on anvil. Little Grace, barely 4, brought laughter to their small home with her endless questions and infectious giggles. The Blackwood family treated their slaves with the calculated benevolence that marked enlightened Southern households. They provided adequate food, decent clothing, and basic medical care, understanding that healthy workers produced better results than broken ones. Judge Blackwood took pride in never using the whip himself, preferring to delegate such unpleasantness to overseers while maintaining his reputation as a humane master. This paternalistic approach masked the fundamental violence of ownership, creating an illusion of kindness that made resistance seem ungrateful. Victor Blackwood, the judge's eldest son, had returned from university the previous summer with new ideas about plantation management that disturbed even his father's pragmatic sensibilities. At 24, Victor possessed his father's intelligence but lacked the older man's prudent restraint. His education at the University of Virginia had filled his head with romantic notions about Southern superiority and scientific theories about racial hierarchy that he was eager to implement through practical experimentation. Victor had developed particular theories about training slave children for maximum efficiency, believing that early discipline could shape character in ways that benefited both master and servant. He designed exercises meant to test obedience, endurance, and proper submission, games that he claimed would.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Prepare young slaves for their future roles while providing valuable data about human development. These sessions took place away from the main house, in root cellars and storage buildings where his subjects could learn important lessons without disturbing household routines. The winter of 1863 had brought unusual cold to central Georgia, with temperatures dropping below freezing for days at a time. Ice formed on water troughs and frost killed the last hardy vegetables, forcing everyone indoors except for essential work. It was during one of these bitter cold snaps that Victor decided his young charges needed a lesson in winter survival, selecting Rebecca, Jonathan, and little Grace along with 2 other children for what he called endurance training. The root cellar behind the main house had been dug deep into Georgia clay, its stone walls designed to keep vegetables fresh through summer heat. In winter it became a frigid chamber where temperatures barely rose above freezing even on sunny days. Victor led the 5 children inside, explaining that they would practice patience and obedience by remaining quiet and still until he returned. He secured the heavy wooden door from outside, promising to return within an hour to check their progress. But Victor became distracted by other pursuits, losing track of time as he often did when absorbed in his theoretical studies. Hours passed while the children huddled together in the root cellar's stone darkness, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Their small bodies couldn't generate enough heat to combat the penetrating cold, and as night fell, their whispered reassurances to each other grew weaker and finally ceased altogether. Celia realized her children were missing when they failed to appear for their usual evening meal. Her initial concern transformed to panic as darkness fell without any sign of Rebecca, Jonathan or Grace. Isaiah joined the search, along with other worried parents whose children had also vanished. They called through the quarters, checked the barn and stables, searched the woods near Sweetwater Creek with lanterns casting desperate circles of light through the trees. It was Moses, the head stable hand, who discovered the children the next morning. He had been searching outbuildings for a missing harness when he heard the root cellar door banging in the wind, its heavy wooden planks having worked loose from their hasps during the night. Inside he found 5 small forms huddled together in the corner, their faces blue with cold, their small hands still clasped together in their final moments of life. Victor appeared at the scene within minutes of Moses's horrific discovery, his face arranging itself into appropriate expressions of shock and dismay. He claimed to know nothing about how the children had come to be in the root cellar, suggesting they must have been playing hide-and-seek and accidentally trapped themselves inside. The door latch was old and unreliable, he explained to his father, and children often didn't understand such dangers until it was too late. Judge Blackwood accepted his son's explanation without extensive questioning, perhaps because the alternative raised questions he preferred not to answer. An investigation might reveal uncomfortable truths about Victor's activities, potentially damaging the family's reputation during a time when Confederate society could ill afford additional scandals. Better to treat the incident as a tragic accident, a reminder of how quickly childhood games could turn deadly. But Celia had noticed things others missed or chose to ignore. She had seen Victor talking with the children earlier that day, had watched him lead them away from the quarters with promises of a special game. She had observed his dry clothes and clean hands when he appeared at the root cellar, noticed that he showed no signs of having spent time searching in the cold and mud like the other adults. Most telling of all, she had watched his face during Moses's discovery, seeing something in his eyes that looked less like shock and more like satisfaction at an experiment completed. The funeral took place 3 days later in the small cemetery that served the quarters, a patch of ground marked by simple wooden crosses where generations of enslaved people had been laid to rest. Celia stood between the 3 small graves, her face carved from stone, her hands steady despite the trembling in her soul. Isaiah wept openly, his powerful frame shaking with grief that seemed to echo from the earth itself. Around them, the entire quarters gathered in silent solidarity, understanding that this loss carried wounds beyond death. That night, alone in her cabin after Isaiah had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, Celia made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would no longer be simply Celia, property of the Blackwood plantation, mother of children who could be murdered without consequence. From this moment forward, she would be Celia Freeman, a woman who had chosen her own name and would choose her own destiny. The surname Freeman wasn't selected randomly, but carried deep intention. It represented not just her desire for freedom, but her declaration that she already possessed the most important liberty of all, the freedom to act according to her own moral code rather than accepting injustice as inevitable. She wrote the name carefully in the small journal where Aunt Dinah had first taught her letters, practicing the signature until it flowed from her pen like truth itself. In the weeks that followed, Celia returned to her kitchen duties with apparent normalcy, preparing elaborate meals for the Blackwood table with her usual skill and precision. She supervised her assistants with unchanged efficiency, maintained her reputation for culinary excellence, and gave no outward sign that anything fundamental had altered in her relationship with the family that owned her body, but no longer commanded her spirit. But during the long winter nights, when the plantation slept beneath frost and starlight, Celia Freeman began to plan. She walked through memories of every conversation she had overheard in the Blackwood household, every careless comment about business dealings and social connections, every detail about the elaborate wedding being planned for their daughter Margaret. She catalogued guests, studied routines and most importantly, began to gather the plants that Aunt Dinah had taught her to recognize in their winter dormancy. The decision to wait for Margaret's wedding wasn't born from patience but from precision. Celia understood that justice served properly required the right moment, the right circumstances and the right audience. A simple poisoning would be investigated, solved and forgotten. But an event that destroyed Atlanta's most powerful families during their moment of greatest celebration would send shockwaves through Confederate society that could never be contained or explained away. She began her preparations with the methodical care of a general planning a military campaign, understanding that she would have only one opportunity to execute her vision of justice. Every detail had to be perfect, every timing precise, every target carefully selected based on their complicity in the system that had murdered her children and called it an accident. As winter slowly gave way to spring and wedding preparations intensified throughout Magnolia Heights, Celia Freeman smiled and cooked and served as she always had. But beneath her calm exterior, she was becoming something far more dangerous than the Blackwood family could possibly imagine, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything necessary to take away what others valued most. Part 2. The Predator's domain. Spring arrived at Magnolia Heights with deceptive beauty, painting the plantation in soft pastels that masked the darkness growing within its boundaries. Cherry trees bloomed along the carriage drive while daffodils pushed through the rich soil, their cheerful faces turned toward a sun that seemed to shine with particular brilliance on Confederate prosperity. The magnolia trees that gave the estate its name burst into magnificent white blooms, their waxy petals releasing perfume so intoxicating that visitors often remarked they could smell paradise itself. Victor Blackwood moved through this garden paradise like a serpent among flowers, his presence casting shadows even in the brightest sunshine. The tragedy of the root cellar had affected him not at all, beyond requiring him to develop more careful methods for his educational experiments. He had concluded that the problem lay not in his techniques but in insufficient preparation of his subjects, and he began developing more sophisticated approaches to what he termed character development. His father's library provided extensive resources for his studies, volumes on human psychology and racial theory that supported his conviction that proper training could maximize the efficiency of slave labor while minimizing the need for crude physical punishment. Victor believed himself to be pioneering a more enlightened approach to plantation management, one that would serve as a model for the post-war South he confidently expected to emerge victorious. The younger Blackwood son had established his headquarters in a converted tobacco barn at the plantation's eastern edge, far enough from the main house to avoid disturbing his mother's delicate sensibilities, but close enough to maintain supervision over his growing collection of subjects. He had requisitioned materials for what he called his laboratory, tables and chairs of various heights, measuring devices, notebooks for recording observations and specialized equipment ordered from medical supply companies in Charleston. Victor's experiments had evolved beyond simple endurance tests to include studies of pain tolerance, memory capacity, and behavioral modification through systematic reward and punishment. He recruited test subjects from among the plantation's children, selecting those whose parents held positions of particular importance to ensure cooperation. Kitchen workers, stable hands and house servants found their offspring chosen for these educational opportunities, understanding that refusal might result in reassignment to field work or worse. The sessions typically occurred during the afternoon hours when most adults were occupied with their assigned duties and couldn't monitor their children's activities. Victor would summon his subjects with promises of treats or privileges, leading them to his laboratory where he conducted what he described as games designed to improve their minds and strengthen their character. These games involved increasingly sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation designed to break down individual will while building absolute obedience. Celia observed these developments with growing alarm, noting which children disappeared for hours at a time and returned with haunted expressions they couldn't explain. She began keeping careful mental records of Victor's patterns, tracking when he selected subjects and where he conducted his sessions. Her heart ached for every child who entered his laboratory, knowing that her own 3 had died because she failed to recognize the danger in time. Sarah, her assistant baker, had a son named Marcus who began exhibiting disturbing changes after several sessions with Victor. The normally cheerful boy became withdrawn and fearful, starting at sudden noises and refusing to leave his mother's side when work permitted. When Sarah gently questioned him about his experiences
with Master Victor, Marcus would only shake his head and beg not to be sent back to the games. Betty's twin daughters, Lydia and Ruth, returned from their educational sessions with matching bruises on their wrists and a strange reluctance to speak above whispers. They had previously been among the quarter's most talkative children, chattering constantly about their adventures and discoveries. Now they moved through their days like small ghosts, completing assigned tasks with mechanical precision, but showing no spark of curiosity or joy. Young Lucy discovered her younger brother Samuel cowering in their cabin after what Victor called a memory exercise, his small body shaking with terror as he repeated numbers in precise sequence. When Lucy tried to comfort him, Samuel pushed her away and continued his recitation, as if forgetting the numbers might bring consequences too terrible to contemplate. The sight of her brother's hollow eyes haunted Lucy's dreams, but she knew better than to complain about a master's educational methods. Victor documented each session meticulously, recording observations about his subjects' responses to various stimuli and developing theories about optimal techniques for achieving desired behavioral outcomes. His notebooks filled with detailed descriptions of successful interventions and failed approaches, creating what he believed would become a valuable scientific resource for future plantation managers throughout the South. The young master took particular pride in his innovation of combining physical discomfort with psychological pressure, finding that subjects who experienced both simultaneously showed more rapid progress toward complete submission. Cold water treatments proved especially effective when combined with isolation and repetitive questioning, breaking down resistance more efficiently than traditional whipping while leaving fewer visible marks that might disturb household routines. Mrs. Constance Blackwood remained willfully ignorant of her son's activities, choosing to interpret his scholarly pursuits as evidence of intellectual development rather than investigating their practical applications. She prided herself on maintaining a refined household free from the crude realities of plantation management, preferring to focus on social obligations and wedding preparations rather than concerning herself with Victor's educational theories. Judge Blackwood harbored growing suspicions about his eldest son's methods but found himself trapped by his own rhetoric about enlightened slave management. He had spent years criticizing neighboring planters for their reliance on physical punishment, positioning himself as a progressive thinker who believed in training rather than breaking human property. Admitting that Victor's approach might be problematic would require acknowledging flaws in his own philosophical framework. The judge attempted to address his concerns indirectly, suggesting that Victor might benefit from spending time in Atlanta observing more experienced managers rather than developing theoretical approaches in isolation. But Victor dismissed these suggestions with academic arguments about the superiority of scientific methodology over traditional practices, insisting that his innovations would prove their worth through measurable results. As summer progressed and wedding preparations intensified, Victor's confidence in his methods grew alongside his appetite for more challenging experiments. He began extending session durations and increasing the complexity of his psychological manipulations, convinced that he was approaching breakthrough discoveries that would revolutionize plantation efficiency. His subjects became increasingly damaged, their personalities fragmenting under pressures their young minds couldn't comprehend or resist. Celia watched this systematic destruction of innocence with a rage that burned steadier and brighter than any forge fire. Every broken child she encountered strengthened her resolve to ensure that Victor Blackwood faced consequences proportional to his crimes. But she also understood that targeting him alone would be insufficient justice, since his behavior was enabled and protected by a family and social system that valued property rights over human dignity. The Blackwood household operated according to rhythms that had remained unchanged for decades, patterns of privilege and service that seemed as natural and inevitable as seasonal cycles. Morning began before dawn in the kitchen, where Celia and her assistants prepared breakfast for the main house while planning elaborate meals for guests who arrived with increasing frequency as Margaret's wedding approached. The rhythm of chopping and stirring, of bread rising and meat roasting, provided a comforting counterpoint to the darker currents flowing through plantation life. Margaret Blackwood had blossomed into the perfect Confederate belle, her golden hair arranged in fashionable ringlets and her wasp waist emphasized by corsets that left her breathless but stunning. At 20, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that inspired poetry from young men and envy from other women, combined with enough intelligence to navigate social complexities without threatening masculine authority. Her engagement to James Ashford represented everything her parents had hoped to achieve through careful cultivation of their daughter's assets. The wedding preparations consumed the plantation's resources and attention with increasing intensity as autumn arrived. Seamstresses worked around the clock creating Margaret's trousseau, while gardeners prepared elaborate floral arrangements and carpenters constructed additional dining areas to accommodate the expected crowd. Every detail required perfection, since the celebration would establish the Blackwood family's social standing for the post-war period. Everyone confidently expected to favor Confederate interests. James Ashford arrived at Magnolia Heights in late October, bringing with him a retinue of family members and business associates who would remain as guests until after the ceremony. The groom impressed everyone with his dignified bearing and obvious devotion to Margaret, though Celia noticed darker currents in conversations she overheard while serving meals. The Ashford family fortune derived largely from military supply contracts that involved providing substandard equipment to Confederate forces while charging premium prices, a form of profiteering that enriched prominent families while costing soldiers their lives. Colonel William Ashford, James's father, spoke freely about business opportunities created by wartime shortages, boasting about contracts that generated enormous profits through creative interpretations of quality specifications. His wife Eleanor listened with approving smiles while their other children contributed observations about additional ventures that might prove profitable as the war continued. These conversations revealed a level of callous calculation that shocked even Celia's hardened sensibilities. The guest list for Margaret's wedding read like a directory of Confederate Georgia's most influential families, each name representing wealth built upon slave labor and political power derived from human bondage. Mayor Douglas Mitchell would attend with his wife Helen, bringing their reputation for brutally suppressing any hint of abolitionist sentiment in Atlanta's growing population. Banker Samuel Worthington and his wife Priscilla controlled much of the region's financial infrastructure, using their position to funnel resources toward Confederate military efforts while profiting from both sides of various transactions. Frederick Caldwell had earned his invitation through services that extended far beyond medicine, serving as an expert witness in legal proceedings that returned escaped slaves to their owners, while certifying the mental incompetence of free blacks who accumulated too much property or influence. His wife Martha contributed to these efforts by organizing social events that raised funds for Confederate causes while providing cover for more questionable activities. Merchant George Patterson had built his fortune by exploiting wartime scarcities, cornering markets in essential goods and selling them at inflated prices to desperate consumers while reserving the highest quality items for wealthy clients who could afford premium costs. His business practices enriched his family while contributing to civilian suffering throughout the region, but his social standing remained unquestioned due to his generous contributions to appropriate causes. Each guest represented a different aspect of the system that had killed Celia's children and countless others, their wealth and status built upon foundations of human suffering disguised as natural order. Their names filled her mental ledger with mathematical precision, each entry representing specific crimes that demanded specific justice. She began studying their individual characteristics with the same attention she devoted to understanding spice combinations, learning their preferences and weaknesses with scholarly dedication. Victor's presence at family gatherings provided opportunities for Celia to observe his interactions with other Confederate leaders, noting how his educational theories impressed men who saw potential applications for post-war labor management. His reputation as an innovative thinker grew among visitors who viewed his methods as evidence of Southern intellectual superiority, validating their conviction that they represented a more advanced civilization than their Northern opponents. The young master took particular pleasure in describing his techniques to other plantation heirs, sharing detailed accounts of successful interventions while soliciting suggestions for additional experiments. These conversations revealed the extent to which Victor's cruelty was not aberrant behavior but logical extension of beliefs shared throughout Confederate society, making him a representative rather than an exception. As November deepened and wedding preparations reached fever pitch, Celia began her most dangerous work. Using knowledge gained from Aunt Dinah's teachings, she started gathering plants during moonless nights when darkness provided cover for activities that couldn't be observed or questioned. Georgia's forests offered abundant opportunities for someone who knew where to look and when to harvest, with autumn providing optimal conditions for collecting roots and berries at peak potency. Pokeweed grew wild along fence lines and forest edges, its purple berries containing compounds that could ease pain in tiny doses but caused progressive organ failure when consumed in larger quantities. Celia gathered these berries during their final ripening, when concentrated alkaloids reached maximum strength, drying them carefully in hidden locations where their preparation wouldn't be discovered. The process required weeks of patient work, grinding and concentrating the toxic elements while testing dosages on small animals to ensure predictable effects. Castor beans offered different possibilities, their ricin content providing delayed effects that would be difficult to trace to specific sources. These seeds grew abundantly in Georgia's climate, often cultivated as ornamental plants whose beautiful foliage masked deadly potential. Celia collected mature beans from various locations, preparing extracts through techniques Aunt Dinah had demonstrated years earlier during their private lessons about plants that healed or harmed depending on preparation and dosage. Oleander presented the most challenging harvesting opportunity, since the flowering shrubs were typically cultivated in prominent locations where gathering activities might be observed. But several estate gardens included mature oleander plants, their pink and white blossoms concealing cardiac glycosides powerful enough to stop hearts within hours of consumption. Celia waited for opportunities when garden maintenance provided legitimate reasons for her presence, carefully collecting leaves and flowers that could be processed into concentrated preparations. The winter months provided ideal conditions for this secretive work, with shortened daylight hours and harsh weather keeping most plantation residents indoors except for essential activities. Celia used her position as head cook to justify movement throughout the estate, checking stored vegetables and preserved foods while actually visiting hidden caches where her gathered materials underwent slow processing into increasingly concentrated forms. Her makeshift laboratory occupied a forgotten corner of the old smokehouse, where dried plant materials could be ground and mixed without creating suspicious odors or attracting unwanted attention. She worked by candlelight during the coldest hours before dawn, when even the most dedicated overseers remained in their quarters and plantation security relaxed into winter routines. Each session brought her closer to possessing the tools necessary for implementing justice on a scale appropriate to the crime she had witnessed. Part 3. The gifted student winter settled over Magnolia Heights like a heavy quilt, muffling sounds and slowing the plantation's usual rhythms to a contemplative pace that suited Celia's increasingly complex preparations. The kitchen's warmth became a sanctuary where she could work with absolute concentration, her assistants grateful for the comfort while remaining unaware of the darker purposes their head cook pursued during solitary hours when darkness cloaked her true activities. Sarah had grown to trust Celia's judgment completely over their years of collaboration, accepting without question the head cook's insistence on handling certain preparations personally. When Celia explained that she was developing new seasoning blends for the wedding feast, Sarah nodded approvingly and focused on her own specialties of bread and pastries, leaving her supervisor free to experiment with combinations that bore no resemblance to traditional culinary arts. Betty demonstrated similar faith in Celia's expertise, particularly after receiving praise from the main house for recent meals that had impressed even the most discriminating guests. Her work with vegetables and preserved foods required attention to detail that kept her occupied throughout each day, providing natural explanation for Celia's frequent absences to gather additional ingredients from various locations around the plantation grounds. Young Lucy remained enthusiastic about learning advanced cooking techniques, interpreting Celia's secretive behavior as evidence of special knowledge that would eventually be shared with deserving students. Her eagerness to please made her an ideal assistant for tasks that required discretion, following instructions precisely without asking uncomfortable questions about purposes or methods that might seem unusual to outside observers. The main house buzzed with increasing activity as Margaret's wedding approached, creating opportunities for Celia to overhear conversations that revealed additional details about guest backgrounds and business relationships. She learned that Mayor Mitchell had personally authorized the execution of 3 suspected Union sympathizers whose only crime was expressing doubts about Confederate victory, while his wife Helen organized social events that raised funds for purchasing equipment used in these judicial murders. Banker Worthington's financial manipulations extended far beyond simple war profiteering to include schemes that deliberately impoverished small farmers and working families, foreclosing on properties when owners couldn't meet artificially inflated interest payments during wartime economic disruption. His wife Priscilla used her social position to identify vulnerable families, gathering intelligence that her husband exploited for maximum financial advantage while maintaining a reputation for Christian charity. Dr. Caldwell's medical practice served as cover for activities that included conducting illegal experiments on slave patients who couldn't refuse treatment or report abuses. His wife Martha assisted in these endeavors by recruiting subjects through her charity work, identifying individuals whose disappearances wouldn't generate troublesome investigations. Their collaboration had resulted in numerous deaths that were officially attributed to natural causes but actually represented deliberate medical murder disguised as scientific research. These revelations strengthened Celia's conviction that her planned intervention represented justice rather than simple revenge, since each intended target had committed crimes that demanded accountability regardless of personal motivations. She began developing individualized approaches for each guest, selecting toxins and dosages that would produce effects appropriate to their specific forms of evil while ensuring that innocent parties would be protected from harm. The pokeweed preparations required the most careful calibration since the plant's active compounds produced varied effects depending on concentration and individual physiology. Celia conducted extensive experiments using mathematical calculations based on estimated body weights and physiological characteristics, testing different formulations on captured rodents whose reactions provided valuable data about timing and intensity of various symptoms. Victor would receive the strongest concentration designed to produce maximum suffering over an extended period before eventual death. The pokeweed alkaloids would attack his nervous system progressively, beginning with disorientation and coordination problems that would gradually worsen into complete paralysis while leaving his mind clear enough to understand exactly what was happening and why. Justice demanded that he experience the helplessness and terror he had inflicted on so many children. Judge Blackwood would receive a castor bean preparation that would work more slowly but with equal certainty, allowing him time to comprehend the complete destruction of his family's legacy while his own body systematically failed. The ricin would attack his digestive system first, producing intense pain and nausea before progressing to organ failure that would leave him conscious but dying over several days of increasing agony. Mrs. Blackwood would face oleander poisoning that would affect her heart rhythm, causing irregular beats and chest pain that would crescendo into cardiac arrest during the reception's most celebratory moments. Her death would appear sudden and shocking to observers, providing a dramatic counterpoint to the slower suffering experienced by male family members who bore greater responsibility for their household's crimes. Margaret presented a more complex ethical challenge since her youth and limited agency raised questions about her actual culpability for family sins. But Celia's investigations had revealed that the young woman actively participated in Victor's educational programs, often suggesting subjects for his experiments and observing sessions with apparent enjoyment rather than horror. Her enthusiastic support for her brother's activities demonstrated complicity that demanded consequences, though perhaps less severe than those planned for other family members. James Ashford would receive oleander extract calculated to produce cardiac symptoms that would initially seem survivable, allowing him to witness his new bride's death before succumbing to his own poisoning. The psychological torture of watching Margaret die while experiencing his own approaching fate seemed appropriate punishment for someone whose family fortune was built upon providing defective equipment that caused soldier deaths throughout Confederate armies. The elder Ashfords would face combinations designed to produce spectacular but rapid deaths that would serve as warnings to other war profiteers about the eventual consequences of their greed. Colonel Ashford would receive pokeweed preparations that would cause violent convulsions and respiratory failure, while his wife Eleanor would experience castor bean poisoning that would attack her digestive system with devastating efficiency. Mayor Mitchell and his wife would both receive oleander extracts that would cause simultaneous cardiac events, their deaths serving as symbolic justice for their role in authorizing executions of innocent civilians. Banker Worthington would face castor bean poisoning that would destroy his digestive system over several hours of increasing agony, while his wife Priscilla would experience pokeweed
toxicity that would cause progressive neurological failure. Dr. Caldwell would receive a special combination of all three toxins, ensuring that his death would be particularly prolonged and painful as appropriate punishment for his medical crimes against helpless patients. His wife Martha would face oleander poisoning that would cause cardiac arrest, but only after witnessing her husband's extended suffering as retribution for her recruitment of experimental subjects. The remaining guests would receive dosages calculated to ensure death, but with less elaborate suffering since their crimes, while significant, were less personal than those committed by the primary targets. Their deaths would serve as warnings to others who profited from human bondage and wartime suffering, demonstrating that even the most powerful individuals faced eventual accountability for their actions. Preparing these various extracts required months of careful work, with each toxin demanding different processing techniques and storage methods to maintain potency until the moment of administration. Celia developed systematic approaches for each plant, grinding dried materials into fine powders that could be dissolved in alcohol or mixed with other substances to mask their presence in food or drink. The pokeweed required particular attention during processing since its alkaloids could be absorbed through skin contact and cause accidental poisoning of anyone handling the materials improperly. Celia learned to work with gloves made from pig intestines, creating barriers that protected her hands while allowing sufficient dexterity for precise measurements and mixing procedures.
Castor bean preparation involved extracting ricin through careful heating and cooling cycles that concentrated the toxic proteins while eliminating other compounds that might interfere with their effectiveness. The process required days of patient work with constant attention to temperature control and timing that left no room for error or distraction. Oleander processing presented different challenges since the cardiac glycosides were sensitive to light and heat in ways that could reduce their potency if extraction wasn't performed under carefully controlled conditions. Celia learned to work during the coldest hours before dawn, using minimal candlelight while maintaining precise timing throughout multiple stages of preparation. Storage presented additional complications since the concentrated extracts needed protection from temperature fluctuations and contamination while remaining easily accessible for final preparation phases. Celia created hidden caches throughout the plantation grounds, burying sealed containers in locations she could find even in darkness while ensuring that accidental discovery was virtually impossible. Her mental calculations grew increasingly complex as she refined dosages based on estimated guest characteristics and planned timing for administration during the wedding reception. Each person would receive toxins through their champagne glass during the ceremonial toast, ensuring simultaneous consumption while allowing for individual variations in dosage and toxin combinations. The champagne itself would provide ideal camouflage for her preparations, since its effervescence and alcohol content would mask any unusual tastes while ensuring rapid absorption of toxic compounds into bloodstreams. The ceremonial nature of the toast would guarantee that every guest consumed their entire portion within moments of each other, creating synchronized onset of symptoms that would prevent any possibility of warning others or seeking effective treatment. Margaret's wedding preparations provided perfect cover for Celia's final phases of planning, since the elaborate celebration required extensive coordination between kitchen staff and outside vendors who would supply additional food and beverages for the expanded guest list. These complications created natural explanations for Celia's increased attention to detail and her insistence on personally handling certain aspects of meal preparation. The Blackwood family's growing excitement about their daughter's upcoming marriage provided tragic irony that Celia savored as she completed her preparations for their final celebration. Their joy would transform into horror as they realized that their moment of greatest triumph had become the stage for their complete destruction, with their most trusted servant serving as the instrument of justice they had never expected to face. Part 4. The Secret Knowledge. The knowledge that Aunt Dinah had passed to Celia carried roots deeper than Georgia soil, stretching back through generations of women who had learned to survive by understanding the delicate balance between healing and harming that nature offered to those wise enough to read her signs. This wisdom had traveled across oceans in the memories of enslaved women, hidden in songs and stories that white masters dismissed as primitive superstition, while their wives secretly sought treatments for ailments that learned doctors couldn't cure. Dinah's grandmother had been among the fortunate few who survived the Middle Passage while retaining enough strength to work plantation fields, but her true value lay in knowledge that couldn't be sold or stolen by those who claimed ownership of her body. She understood which roots eased childbirth pain, which leaves reduced fever, which berries could stop bleeding or start it depending on need. More importantly, she recognized that the same plants that preserved life could also end it when circumstances demanded ultimate solutions to impossible problems. This botanical wisdom had been shared carefully through generations of women who understood that knowledge represented both power and danger in a world where slaves weren't supposed to possess either. Each plant carried specific lessons about timing and dosage, about preparation methods that determined whether leaves brought healing or death, about the precise measurements that separated medicine from murder in ways that white science was only beginning to comprehend. Dinah had chosen Celia as her successor after observing the young woman's natural intuition for flavors and her photographic memory for recipes and techniques. But more than culinary skill, she recognized in Celia a moral intelligence that could be trusted with knowledge that might someday prove necessary for survival or justice. Their lessons had begun innocently enough, with discussions about medicinal teas and poultices that could treat common ailments without requiring expensive doctors. The summer evenings when kitchen work slowed had provided perfect opportunities for these educational sessions, with Dinah sharing observations about plants that grew wild around the plantation while teaching Celia to recognize their seasonal changes and optimal harvesting times. They would walk together through fields and forests, the older woman pointing out specific leaves and roots while explaining their properties and traditional uses in detailed lessons that Celia memorized with scholarly precision. Cherokee women had taught Dinah's grandmother about native Georgia plants during brief periods when circumstances allowed interaction between different populations of exploited people. These exchanges had occurred secretly during market days or religious gatherings where slaves and displaced tribal members found themselves in proximity long enough to share survival knowledge that might prove crucial during future emergencies. The Cherokee understanding of plant medicine was far more sophisticated than European traditions, incorporating complex knowledge about seasonal variations, preparation methods, and combination effects that had been developed over thousands of years of careful observation. Their women had learned to identify dozens of plants that could serve multiple purposes depending on how they were processed and administered, creating pharmaceutical wisdom that rivaled anything taught in medical schools. Pokeweed had been among their most important discoveries, a plant that grew abundantly throughout the southeastern forests and offered both nutritional and medicinal benefits when properly prepared. Young shoots could be boiled and eaten as spring vegetables, providing essential nutrients after long winter months of limited fresh food. But mature plants contained alkaloids that could be concentrated into preparations powerful enough to induce labor, reduce swelling, or eliminate enemies who threatened community survival. The Cherokee had developed precise protocols for pokeweed preparation, understanding that timing and technique determined whether the plant served as medicine or weapon. Roots harvested during autumn contained highest concentrations of active compounds, while berries collected at peak ripeness offered different alkaloid profiles that produced varied physiological effects. Processing methods involving drying, grinding, and extraction could concentrate these compounds into preparations of extraordinary potency. Castor beans represented another plant whose dual nature required careful understanding and respectful handling. The Cherokee had cultivated these plants both for their ornamental beauty and their practical applications, using oil extracted from the beans for various medicinal purposes while recognizing that other compounds contained within the seeds could cause death if improperly prepared or administered. Traditional Cherokee medicine included detailed knowledge about ricin extraction and concentration, though they typically used these techniques for eliminating dangerous animals rather than human enemies. Their methods involved careful heating and cooling cycles that separated toxic proteins from other compounds, creating concentrated preparations that could be stored for extended periods without losing potency. Oleander had been introduced to Cherokee territory through contact with European settlers, but native women quickly recognized its similarity to indigenous plants they had used for cardiac treatments and ritual purposes. Their experiments with oleander preparations revealed that the plant's cardiac glycosides could be concentrated through careful extraction methods, producing medicines that could regulate heart rhythms in small doses or stop hearts completely when administered in larger quantities. This accumulated wisdom had been preserved and transmitted through informal networks of women who understood that survival often depended on knowledge their oppressors preferred to keep hidden or dismissed as worthless folklore. Dinah had been privileged to receive this education during her youth, when circumstances allowed extended contact with older women who carried these traditions in their memories and their hands. The teaching methods emphasized practical application rather than abstract theory, with each lesson including hands-on experience that allowed students to develop intuitive understanding of plant properties and preparation techniques. Dinah had learned to identify dozens of plants by their scent, texture, and seasonal characteristics, developing sensory skills that allowed her to work effectively even in darkness or under stressful conditions. Mathematical precision was crucial for safe application of this knowledge, since the difference between healing and killing often involved measurements accurate to fractions of ounces or variations in timing measured by hours rather than days. Dinah had learned to calculate dosages based on body weight, age, and health status, developing formulas that could be adjusted for individual circumstances while maintaining predictable results. Storage and preservation techniques were equally important, since many plants lost their potency quickly unless properly processed and protected from light, heat, and moisture. Dinah had mastered methods for creating stable preparations that could be stored for months or years without degradation, ensuring that crucial medicines would be available when circumstances demanded their use. The ethical framework surrounding this knowledge was as important as the technical skills, since plants powerful enough to heal could also cause tremendous harm if used carelessly or maliciously. Dinah had been taught that such knowledge carried moral obligations to use it wisely and only when absolutely necessary for protecting life or achieving justice that couldn't be obtained through other means. These moral teachings emphasized that plant medicine was part of a larger spiritual framework that recognized connections between all living things and demanded respect for the balance between creation and destruction that governed natural cycles. Using plants to cause harm was acceptable only when victims had themselves disrupted this balance through actions that threatened community survival or violated fundamental moral principles. Dinah had shared this complete philosophical framework with Celia during their years of collaboration, ensuring that her student understood not just techniques but also the spiritual and ethical dimensions of plant knowledge. These discussions had often occurred during the longest summer evenings when extended daylight allowed time for contemplation and conversation that went far beyond practical instruction. The older woman had emphasized that true mastery of plant medicine required understanding each species as a complete entity with its own personality and preferences rather than simply memorizing lists of properties and applications. This holistic approach demanded patience and observation that allowed practitioners to develop intuitive relationships with plants that guided successful harvesting and preparation. Seasonal rhythms were crucial for this understanding since most plants concentrated their active compounds at specific times when environmental conditions optimized their chemical composition. Spring offered opportunities for gathering young growth with different properties than mature plants, while autumn provided access to roots and berries that had accumulated strength throughout the growing season. Lunar cycles also influenced plant potency, with traditional practitioners believing that harvesting during specific moon phases enhanced the effectiveness of their preparations. Dinah had taught Celia to observe these patterns and plan her gathering activities accordingly, though she had also emphasized that emergency situations might require working with whatever materials were available regardless of optimal timing. Weather conditions affected plant chemistry in ways that experienced practitioners learned to recognize and exploit, with drought stress often concentrating active compounds while excessive moisture might dilute their effectiveness. Understanding these variations allowed skilled practitioners to adjust their techniques and dosages to compensate for environmental factors that influence plant potency. The preparation methods themselves required techniques that had been refined through generations of careful experimentation, with each step designed to maximize extraction of desired compounds while minimizing degradation or contamination. Grinding, heating, cooling, and extraction procedures followed precise protocols that had been proven effective through centuries of practical application. Tool selection was important for maintaining the integrity of plant preparations, with traditional practitioners preferring implements made from specific materials that wouldn't react with plant compounds or introduce unwanted elements into the final products. Dinah had taught Celia to avoid metal tools when possible, using stone, wood, or bone implements that wouldn't alter the chemical composition of her preparations. Testing procedures were essential for ensuring both safety and effectiveness, with experienced practitioners developing reliable methods for evaluating the potency of their preparations before using them for serious purposes. These tests typically involved careful observation of effects on small animals, allowing practitioners to adjust dosages and methods based on empirical results rather than theoretical calculations. Documentation was traditionally handled through oral tradition rather than written records, since literacy was rare among enslaved populations and written evidence of such knowledge could prove dangerous if discovered by hostile authorities. Dinah had taught Celia to memorize vast amounts of detailed information, developing memory techniques that allowed precise recall of complex formulas and procedures. Now, as winter deepened around Magnolia Heights and Margaret's wedding approached, Celia found herself drawing upon every aspect of this inherited wisdom as she prepared to implement justice on a scale that would honor both her murdered children and the generations of women who had preserved this knowledge for moments when it would be needed most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.